The rain came down like an endless curtain, soaking the streets in a gray haze that mirrored Jake's mood. He stood beneath a flickering streetlight outside the gym, his hoodie pulled tight against the biting cold of the early London morning. It was 5 a.m., a time when most of the city still slept, wrapped in warmth and dreams. Jake wasn't sleeping. He was fighting a battle, not against the world, but against himself. For months, maybe even years, he had let life dictate his moves. He had drifted through his days, reacting instead of acting, existing instead of living. The excuses had piled up like weights on his shoulders. I'll start next week. I don't have the time. It's too late to change. He used to say those things until they became his truth. But deep inside, he knew what he was really afraid of, failing again. Because failure wasn't new to him, it was a familiar shadow that followed him wherever he went. Losing his job had been one blow, but losing faith in himself had been the knockout. As the gym lights glowed faintly through the fogged windows, Jake hesitated. He looked at the door like it was some kind of test. His heart was thumping, not from fear of the workout, but from the quiet dread of confronting the man in the mirror, the man he'd been avoiding. But this time, something inside him refused to back down. Maybe it was exhaustion from running from his own potential, or maybe it was the whisper of a long-buried voice telling him he was meant for more. He took a breath that steamed in the cold air, clenched his fists, and pushed the door open. The smell of metal, rubber, and sweat hit him like a memory. The hum of machines, the faint music from someone's headphones, the rhythmic clang of weights, it was a world of effort, pain, and transformation. Jake dropped his bag by the bench, peeled off his soaked hoodie, and caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. The reflection staring back wasn't the hero of a movie. It was a tired, slightly overweight man with hollow eyes and a scruffy beard. But there was something new there, a flicker, small but undeniable, of determination. He strapped on his gloves, grabbed the barbell, and started with a warm-up. His muscles complained immediately, unaccustomed to the demand. He grimaced as he lifted, each representative reminding him how far he'd let himself go. By the 10th, his arms shook uncontrollably. He wanted to stop. He wanted to drop the weight and walk out, telling himself it was too much, too soon. But a voice inside whispered, "This is what you came for." So, he pushed through. One more representative, then another. Every movement felt like fire beneath his skin, every breath a small victory. The pain wasn't his enemy anymore, it was his teacher. He began to understand that growth wasn't supposed to be comfortable. Growth demanded sacrifice, and sacrifice demanded mental toughness. He remembered what his father used to say, "When life gets hard, most people quit because they mistake discomfort for failure." Back then, Jake hadn't understood. Now, drenched in sweat, he did. Failure wasn't falling down, it was staying there. The music in the background seemed to fade away as he focused on the rhythm of his breathing. His mind wanted to give up long before his body actually needed to. That was the real battle, the space between his limits and his potential. Every time he lifted that bar, he was telling the weak part of his mind, "You don't control me anymore." He pushed until his arms refused to move, dropped the weight with a loud metallic clang, and stumbled back. His heart pounded like thunder in his chest, his vision slightly blurred from effort. He fell to his knees, chest heaving, sweat pouring down his face and dripping onto the rubber floor. For a moment, he just knelt there, feeling the storm inside him breaking. But then, something strange happened. He smiled. Not the kind of smile you give when you win easily, but the quiet, humble smile of someone who has faced himself and survived. He realized this wasn't about muscles or looks. It wasn't even about the gym. It was about self-respect. He was earning his own trust back, one painful representative at a time. Jake sat against the wall, watching the steam rise from his skin, and thought about everything he had run from, the job loss, the betrayal, the self-doubt. He had blamed circumstances, people, luck. But none of those things had held him back. It was his own mind that had chained him. The fear of failing had been louder than the hunger to win. Now he understood something powerful. Mental toughness isn't about never feeling weak. It's about refusing to surrender to weakness. It's about getting up every time life knocks you down, even when you don't feel like it. Especially when you don't feel like it. He dragged himself up, grabbed a towel, and stared once more at the mirror. The reflection hadn't changed much, still tired, still rough around the edges, but there was a new look in his eyes. A calm defiance, a quiet belief, the kind that doesn't need words to announce itself. He muttered softly, almost to himself, pain is the price of progress. As he walked out of the gym, the rain had stopped. The clouds were still heavy, but a thin strip of sunlight peeked over the rooftops, painting the wet streets gold. Jake zipped up his hoodie and took a deep breath of the cold morning air. It smelled like new beginnings. For the first time in years, he didn't feel lost. He didn't feel like a man running from his problems. He felt like a man running toward his purpose. The road ahead would be long and brutal. There would be days he'd want to quit, mornings when his alarm would feel like an enemy, and moments when life would hit him harder than before. But he was ready for it. Because now he knew, mental toughness wasn't built in comfort. It was built in the storm. And he had just taken his first step through it. Weeks turned into months, and Jake began to notice the shift, not just in his body, but in his mind. The man who once dragged himself out of bed now woke before the alarm, his feet touching the floor before doubt could reach him. The soreness in his muscles had become familiar, almost comforting, a reminder that he was progressing. His reflection had changed too, shoulders broader, eyes sharper, posture stronger. But the real transformation wasn't the one in the mirror, it was the one in the way he carried himself through life. At work, everything used to overwhelm him. Deadlines, criticism, even small mistakes, they would send him spiraling into self-doubt. But now, there was a calmness in him that no one could quite explain. When his manager dropped a pile of new files on his desk with the words, "Need these done by tomorrow," Jake didn't flinch. He simply nodded, took a breath, and began. He had learned that complaining didn't make challenges smaller, discipline did. He no longer reacted out of frustration, he responded with focus. That was the difference between the old Jake and the new one. There was a strange peace in pressure now. He could feel his heart rate rise, the pulse quicken, but he didn't let it control him. He had trained his body to push through exhaustion, now he was training his mind to push through chaos. While others grumbled about the workload, he found himself zoning in, treating every task like a rep in the gym. One at a time, slow and steady, until it was done. Outside work, he began to notice how people behaved, how quick they were to give up, how easily they let emotions dictate their actions. He didn't judge them, because he'd been the same, but now, he saw things differently. Mental toughness wasn't about being stronger than everyone else, it was about being stronger than your old self. One afternoon, during a meeting, a colleague presented an idea that Jake had spent hours developing. The manager praised the presentation, and Jake felt that familiar heat rise in his chest, anger, unfairness, pride. The old version of him would have snapped, called it out, maybe even caused a scene. But he didn't. Instead, he sat still, breathing through the sting of silence. He thought, if I lose control over small things, how can I handle the big ones? When the meeting ended, he simply walked back to his desk and continued his work. No bitterness, no arguments. He reminded himself, you don't need recognition to validate progress. Because he knew that true strength isn't about proving others wrong, it's about proving yourself right. That evening, as the city dimmed under a pale sunset, Jake found himself once again in the gym. The clang of iron greeted him like an old friend. The same smell, the same music, but he was different now. He moved with purpose. Every lift wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. Every drop of sweat carried a piece of his past weakness, being replaced by quiet resilience. Halfway through his workout, he noticed a younger lad struggling with a bench press. The bar hovered above his chest, trembling, before he gave up and sat up, defeated. Jake walked over, wiped his own sweat, and said, "Go on, one more try." The boy looked doubtful but nodded. Jake helped guide the bar back up as he said, "Your body's not quitting, mate, your mind is lying to you." The boy pushed harder this time, and the bar rose slowly until it locked out. When it did, he grinned through the strain. Jake clapped him on the shoulder. "See, it's never the muscles, it's always the mind." Those words echoed in Jake's head long after the lad left. Because that was the truth of it all. The body follows where the mind leads, and the mind, if left unchecked, leads straight to comfort, excuses, and regret. Jake finished his last set and sat in silence for a while, staring at the barbell. He realized that life outside this gym wasn't much different from what happened inside it. Every problem, every argument, every failure, they were just mental reps. And every time he resisted the urge to quit, he was strengthening something invisible but unbreakable inside him. He thought back to those mornings when he'd struggled even to get out of bed, drowning in self-pity. Now, he woke hungry for challenge. He didn't chase comfort anymore, he chased growth. And the funny thing was, the more he embraced discomfort, the more peace he found. As he wiped down the bench and packed his bag, he caught his reflection again in the mirror. He barely recognized himself, not because he was a different man, but because he finally looked like who he was meant to be all along. Walking home through the cool night air, he passed a cafe window where a group of friends laughed, scrolling through their phones. For a moment, he felt the old tug of envy, that easy, carefree life. But then he smiled, because he knew the truth: ease never built character. Struggle did. Back home, as he stood under the shower, the warm water washed over his sore muscles, and he let out a quiet sigh. Not of pain, but of pride. The world hadn't become easier, he had become tougher. Every late night, every missed comfort, every silent decision to keep going had forged something steel-like inside him. He climbed into bed, tired but content, staring at the ceiling as the city hummed outside. Tomorrow would bring new problems, new pain, new reasons to quit, but he would face them head-on. Because mental toughness wasn't a one-time victory. It was a daily battle, a quiet promise whispered before sleep and kept the next morning. No matter how hard it gets, I'll keep going. Months later, Jake found himself standing backstage, waiting for his turn to speak. The small community hall was filled with rows of eager faces, young students, tired workers, people searching for something more. The air buzzed with quiet anticipation, the kind that comes before something honest, something real. Jake adjusted the microphone in his hand, his palms slightly damp. He had lifted weights heavier than his body, faced mornings colder than steel, but this, standing in front of strangers to share his story, felt like a different kind of challenge. He took a deep breath, stepped forward, and walked onto the stage. The applause that greeted him was polite but curious. He wasn't famous, not a celebrity or a motivational speaker with a rehearsed act. He was just an ordinary man who had decided to stop surrendering. As he looked at the faces in front of him, he saw his old self among them, tired eyes, uncertain hearts, people who'd been beaten down by life but hadn't yet learned how to rise. When the room fell silent, Jake began, his voice calm but firm. "Life won't always go easy on you," he said. "In fact, most of the time, it won't. It'll hit you hard, and sometimes, it'll hit where it hurts most. You'll lose things, people, and parts of yourself you thought you needed. You'll want to quit, you'll want to give up. And when that moment comes, when you're on your knees, asking yourself what the point is, that's where strength begins." The audience leaned forward, drawn by the rawness in his tone. Jake wasn't speaking from a script, he was speaking from experience. He continued, "Mental toughness isn't about being unbreakable. It's about being broken and rebuilding yourself anyway. It's about walking through pain instead of running from it." He paused, scanning the crowd. "You see, there was a time when I thought strength meant never falling. But real strength, the kind that lasts, is found in the getting up. It's found in the moments when no one's watching, when it's just you and your thoughts, and you decide to keep going." A hush filled the hall. Jake could see a few heads nodding, others staring down, lost in their own reflections. He smiled faintly and went on. "People talk a lot about motivation. But motivation fades. Discipline, that's what carries you through when the fire dies. When your alarm rings at 5 in the morning, when your muscles ache, when everything inside you screams to stop, that's when discipline steps in and says, 'Not today.' That's mental toughness. It's not flashy, it's not loud, it's silent, consistent, relentless." He could feel the emotion rise in his chest as he remembered those cold mornings in the gym, those lonely nights when doubt whispered louder than hope. "Every representative I lifted wasn't about building a better body," he said quietly. "It was about building a better mind. Every drop of sweat, every ounce of pain, it taught me that growth doesn't come from comfort. It comes from resistance." A young man in the front row lifted his eyes, visibly moved. Jake caught it, that flicker of connection, and it reminded him why he was there. "You don't need to be the smartest, the fastest, or the strongest," Jake said, his voice gaining strength. "You just need to be the one who refuses to give up. Because every time you push through when it's hard, you're building something no one can take from you, your resilience." He looked around the hall, taking in the quiet faces. "And here's the truth, your mind will quit long before your body ever does. The mind tells you you're done, that you can't go on. But you can. You always can. You just have to decide that you will." The silence that followed was heavy, powerful. Then, slowly, the audience began to applaud, not the loud, cheering kind, but the kind that comes from understanding, from being moved. Jake stood there for a moment, letting it sink in. He smiled, not out of pride, but gratitude. He wasn't there to impress anyone. He was there to remind them, and himself, that no matter how many times life breaks you, you always have the choice to rebuild. As he stepped off the stage, a few people came up to thank him, their voices soft but sincere. But the real reward came later, when he walked home through the quiet streets. The night air was cool, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement. He thought about how far he'd come, from the man who almost gave up, to the one who now stood as proof that struggle can forge strength. He didn't feel like a hero. He just felt steady, grounded, alive, because mental toughness wasn't about reaching perfection, it was about refusing to surrender. And as he looked up at the dim stars above, he whispered to himself with a quiet smile, "I'm still standing. And that's enough."